Guys, this is Elisa Hines. She's our broadcast. Yes, sort of.
So here's the clicker.
Okay.
We should always be speaking into a microphone because they're recording. So we have that mic and we have this mic, and then we have to make sure the people speak into the mic. Okay.
So are all the mics hot?
Are these two together?
This mic is hot. That's for the audience.
Oh, okay. So then what about that mic?
That's for the audience also. So we'll have
Okay.
one on both sides. So
But we walk around a lot, so we're going to have one of those. Okay. So everybody, when you speak, and you will speak, hopefully, pass around the microphone and speak into the microphone because this is being recorded.
Got the right answer, you'll get us Johnny or something.
Right. You want to be very clear about that.
You know, little pieces of
We have to
once you get
have everyone speak into the mic. So questions, everything, you all got to help us because everything needs to be recorded. Because otherwise you hear this one, and then the answer makes no sense. Okay. So welcome everybody. Good morning. I'm breaking my own rule. So I'm Lisa Better. I'm with Avant Energy, and my colleague is Jolynn Rains. We actually have a slide with our pictures. I'm the engagement manager for the cost of service studies that we're conducting. I'm also the electric lead. Jolynn is our water wastewater lead. But we work on this as a team, and we're involved in every aspect together. But I'm technically the engagement lead. Avant Energy is in Minneapolis. It's been around for 30 plus years. It's a privately held firm with about 70 employees. But it's unique in that it actually manages two public power agencies, one in Minnesota and one in northern Michigan. And then it also is, it manages Tariff, which is a tribal organization, and we're the executive director of that organization for a series of tribes in the upper Midwest. We have a trading floor that trades power. We have multidisciplinary consultants. And we have a lot of Oklahoma experience, especially Jolynn has spent a lot of time in Oklahoma. But these are some of the qualifications of similar studies we've done. The most recent being Gainesville Regional Utilities, which is quite similar to Stillwater. Big college town, go Gators. The only difference is they have a natural gas utility as well, but otherwise very similar. I am a director of consulting at Avant. I've been in the utility industry about 30 years. I hate to say that number. I started out in solid waste management back in the day and worked for a small consulting firm in Boston that did waste to energy and did a lot of recycling, MRFs, RDF, you name it. And then from that, I got into non-utility generation projects. And just about any way you can make power, that's a non-utility. Under PURPA, the QFs, like that may sound like Greek to everybody, but a way for non-utility generators to get into the market prior to the restructuring of the market in '99. I was involved in a lot of purchase power agreements. And then I did a lot of natural gas consulting. So over my career, I've slowly worked my way through all the utilities. I worked for the city of Tallahassee for a year and was in their underground utilities department. So we did water, wastewater, stormwater, and natural gas. So I kind of cover all the utilities. And I'm an industrial engineer by undergrad, so I look at everything with an engineering background. But I'm also a certified internal auditor, so I also bring the financial stuff together and the regulatory stuff together. So cost of service and rate design is the weird place where all this comes together. Jolynn.
Good morning. I am the principal at J.M. Rains and Associates, working with Lisa and Avant. We've worked together for, goodness, more than 5 years now. My background is in utility industry, cost of service, and rate design. I've worked with water, wastewater, electric, and natural gas cost of service over the last 27 years. And I've worked a lot in Oklahoma, Texas, and Arizona in water, wastewater, as well as electric. I've also had the privilege of working in the Pacific Rim. So I have done cost of service studies in the Republic of Palau, which is a great place to take out a map of the South Pacific and take a look at where that is, as well as American Samoa, a territory of the United States, Western Samoa, an independent nation, and also Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. So I also specialize in developing pre-treatment programs for wastewater utilities as well as non-rate revenue studies. And the other fun thing that I do, I kind of forget because we're at a lull right now. For the past 15 years, I have been developing procurement for electricity and natural gas for a Fortune 500 company. So I purchase on their behalf electricity and natural gas across the United States in deregulated markets. And I'm happy to say that their load that they purchase in the market is 98% renewable by purchase of renewable energy credits. So I'm excited to be here today, talk about water, wastewater. You probably won't find people who get so excited about this stuff as we do, but it's really nice to be around people who understand it, and we're looking forward to a lot of questions.
So we're going to probably take a break in about an hour or so, because 2 hours is a long time not to have a break, especially after we've all been drinking coffee in the morning. But this is today's agenda. It's a workshop. We want participation. It's a training. It's an opportunity to ask questions. There are no silly questions. This stuff is kind of esoteric until you really break it down. And that's why we're here. We've found through the numerous studies we've conducted over the years that having an educated client who across all sectors kind of understands what we're trying to do enhances the quality of the study and decreases the pain factor on everyone involved, because we rely on you guys so much for data and information. So that's why we're here today. You will leave this hopefully having a better understanding of why we even do a cost of service study. A lot of consultants who do cost of service studies don't really understand why they do it. They've just been trained to do it over the years, and it's like institutional knowledge retires, and they just do it, but they don't know why. So hopefully by the time you leave today, there will not be a test, but if we gave you one, you probably could pass it. So, how do utility financials translate into rate? That's the first topic. And unfortunately, this gets a little tiny on the big screen. It was the best we could do, but hopefully you all recognize a Stillwater's Utility Authority bill. So let's get the mic out here and ask some questions about what information is on this bill. And Dana's the ringer in the crowd for this one. But so why don't you start, Dana?
And tell you what's on there?
Yeah, pick something on the bill. What information is on this bill?
Well, our rates. So for electric, like what our rates are, their usage, which we added to try to be. This is a fairly new bill for us, probably 2.5 years, maybe 3 years. And we wanted to try to be transparent and show the customer the rate so that they could then calculate the rate times their usage and see the base charge individually, versus before we would have just sent them a bill that said electric 102.75 but not showed them the breakdown.
Oh,
so we tried to do
interesting.
that with all of our utilities, water and wastewater, to put on there what size garbage cart they have so that they can see that. So in the past, they wouldn't have seen any of that breakdown. They would have just seen trash was $18.28, but didn't know what they were really getting for that. So.
No, and this bill, like when we pulled it up to prepare for this workshop, we're like, this is a great bill. It's got great, only geeky people like us would be interested in that. This bill has a lot of information. I love the little toilet icon, I have to say. Like, I've not seen that before, but hey, it means something to people. It demystifies what they're being billed for. I love it. So she said they've got rates, they've got usage. What other information do we see on this bill? Who else wants to take a stab? Melissa.
What I like about our bill is it shows you, and you don't have it up here, but it shows you history as a bar graph. And for most people, they're very visual. And so you can go and say, okay, this year was greater usage than last year, and I know that my husband's been running the sprinkler system more. So, it helps us that way. And I really like the visuals.
True. People are I'm a visual person, but people like information presented in graphic, like then it means something. Oh, my water usage went up. That's why my bill went up. Good point. A couple other things, taxes are on this bill. Customer charge, that's a fixed monthly charge. So there's a ton of information on this bill, and it's a great way to communicate to your stakeholders. We used to call them ratepayers back in the day, but they've become customers and stakeholders, right? So that's a big shift in public power and the public utilities industry, is that the relationship between the utility and the customer has become more direct, and you're kind of more directly accountable. It's social media, it's all the other changes that have come along with technology have changed the way you need to interact with your constituents. And they want to interact with you. So this change in the bill that Dana talked about is great. It's a great way. My utility is Orlando Utilities Commission. I often put my bill up on the screen to talk about things, and they've been shifting how they present information. And we'll talk about that a little more in the electric area, because that's where they've changed the most. So how do utility costs relate to the items we've talked about? Who wants to take a stab at that? Hi, Paul.
Good morning,
Christy, can I put you on the spot?
Well, I would say that the utility costs roll up into determining the rates that are presented on the bill and charged to the customer.
Well done. I thought you'd ace that. So precisely, if we're doing things correctly, now over the course of the day, you'll start to see how convoluted this all gets. But in theory, the costs that you incur providing any service should appear in your rate. If it's not, there's a problem. There's a saying, everything you guys do has to show up in your rates, or you're not recovering some costs. So any questions before we move on to the bill, or any comments about the bill? Are you all going to go home and look at your bill? Because the other challenge is now that most people don't get paper bills. I don't know about your territories, but I don't get paper bills. So people aren't looking at their bills. They're not looking at their bill inserts like they used to. And so now, utilities have to figure out new ways to communicate important information to their stakeholders. So we're going to start with some basics. There's a lot of terms that people use interchangeably when we talk about rates and tariffs. So just to bring it back to a real basic level, understanding technically what a rate is. It is a charge designed to collect desired revenue. And here are rate examples taken from your bill. So you have a $9.80 per customer per month residential charge for, I believe, electric. 10.347 cents per kilowatt hour. $9.53 per kilowatt, that's a demand charge for electricity. $7.02 per 1,000 gallon. and $3.37 per 1,000 gallons. So there's lots of different types of rate, and the units matter. A tariff is a different thing. Even though a lot of people will use the word tariff and rate interchangeably, technically, a tariff is a written schedule that sets forth all the rules around application of that rate. So this is when you get into the weeds. But here's an example of Stillwater's distributed generation tariff. So when in doubt about a charge or how it's being administered, you should always go back to the tariff, because that really is the legal, representation of how that charge should be calculated. So now we're going to get a little bit into the economics. I'm not an economist. I'm an engineer. But there's a couple things we can take from a man named James Bonbright. Has anyone in here besides Jolynn ever heard of James Bonbright? Dana? No? James Bonbright wrote the seminal resource book in 1961 called The Principles of Public Utility Rates. And you're all like, oh, I'm going to run out and get that on Amazon and read it tonight, right? As arcane and obtuse as it may sound, it's a really interesting book. Believe it or not, he has a very dry sense of humor, and he talks about all different kinds of rates, like how to regulate trains, all sorts of different types of rates, but in particular public utility rates. Now, in this realm, public utility, the way he uses public utility is actually shareholder owned. You would call it an IOU. But the principles are essentially the same. But that can be a little confusing because he feels that if shareholders own a utility, it's owned by the public versus public power, which is owned by the public. different situations. But he has identified what he's called the 4 functions that public utility rates should achieve. And the first bullet is motivate production, attract capital. So can somebody here break that down into English for me, what they think that means? And everyone will get an opportunity to be put on the spot. Who wants to take the mic? What do you think it means that you want a rate to send a signal? Because rates send signals that affect behavior, right? Like if all of a sudden you have an inclining block rate for water, and you know that if you sprinkle your lawn too much in summer, all of a sudden you're going to trip into a higher rate level, and you're going to have to pay more, it's going to affect your behavior, right? So rates do a lot of things that actually change people's behavior. So why do you think rates should attract capital?
Because we need funding to ensure that the infrastructure can provide what the customers are demanding.
Well said. Well said. It's really that simple. You want to have people invest. Like remember, he's thinking more of an IOU, but it's the same for what you guys do. If you couldn't recover the cost for building the infrastructure in your rates, you would quickly go out of business. You would have no incentive to be a public utility. And in fact, in America, the whole reason we have rural electric cooperatives is because the government stepped in because it was uneconomic to provide power to remote rural areas. There was not enough motivation to attract capital because there were just simply too few users. They couldn't afford it. So the government stepped in and established the rural electric co-op system. So the first purpose of a rate is to incent you to invest in that activity by giving you cost recovery. The second is to incentivize efficiency. So this is a little more, it's to not pay you a windfall so that you don't overinvest and overproduce in that infrastructure, which early in the day IOUs were very guilty of, because If they could increase their infrastructure, they got more profit and they got more recovery. So a regulator had to step in, and it's always a fight at a rate case with an IOU about how much investment is prudent. And you make those decisions every day. Last night, at the city council meeting, the bocce courts, like what is fair? Who makes that decision, right? But rates should send a signal that fulfills that purpose to some extent. A third way that rates should function is that they should ration consumer demand. You've heard if it's too cheap, people overuse it. They don't respect it. So the rate should not incent you to turn your air conditioning on, open all the windows, and leave for a month, right? If your power is too cheap, you don't care. So that's another function of public utility rates. And then finally, I love the fourth bullet, because for a man like James Bonbright, who does not believe in what he calls social engineering, he doesn't believe that rates should differ for low-income people. He calls things like that social engineering. But look at the fourth bullet. He believes rates should distribute income. So let's think about that. In the rates that the city charges, what is an example of a type of rate that would actually distribute income when you really think about it? That somebody's paying more than their fair share, which, since it's a zero-sum gain system without growth, you have to recover all your costs. If somebody pays more, somebody pays less. Somebody's being cross-subsidized. Where would this typically happen in a utility environment?
Between customer classes? Why might that? That's a very good question.
That's why I'm here. Does anybody want to take a stab? Does anybody have a wild guess?
I would say maybe demand, or what they could pull off the system at any given time.
Excellent. So what we call it the principle of ability and willingness to pay. So for example, if you have a larger customer who can afford to pay more and is willing to pay more, then by these principles, they should pay more. It's kind of a supply and demand thing. Like Google or Apple, they're changing the market because they want all renewable power. And I have clients all over the country who they come to and say, we understand that it takes 4 times the amount of solar power to meet our basic demand because of the nature of solar power, but we'll pay for that. We don't care. We want you to give us 100% renewable, and you figure out how to balance it on your system. Ability and willingness to pay. So that's actually a reason, a justifiable reason to cross-subsidize certain customers. Typically, it happens with industrial customers. Typically, industrial customers will cross-subsidize residential customers, but not always. In college towns sometimes, it's exactly the opposite. Residential customers cross-subsidize other customers because there's not a large industrial load. But this is a function that rates should serve, according to Bonbright, and I believe with Bonbright. So in addition to the functions, these are the 8 principles of public utility rates that you'll probably only see in a workshop like this or in a rate case. So this is kind of the handbook. And it seems simplistic sometimes, but it's important. The very first one, rates should be practical. As Dana said, you changed your bill to make it easier and more transparent for people to understand the components of their rate, their consumption, the rate, and then that came to the total number, where before you just gave them the total number. And that's the second one, uncontroversial as to interpretation. You should be able to calculate your own bill. You should be able to understand what cost you're incurring for the consumption on the system. Number 3, you need to meet your revenue requirement, right? If you're not meeting your revenue requirement, then your rates are not doing you justice. They need to be stable from a revenue perspective, which basically means you need to be able to budget. You need to be able to predict how much money is going to come in from month to month. Stable from a rate perspective. That's more your customer's side, right? They need to know what they're going to pay. Do you guys have any kind of balanced billing mechanism? Who wants to describe that? You're only here, can you? Oh, hey.
I'm a customer, you know. We do have average billing. Once you've been a customer for 12 months, your 13th bill. 13th bill, you can be put on average billing, and it's just the rolling 12-month average of your usage. I find it attractive because it limits fluctuation month to month, so it's easier to budget.
That's exactly that principle. So you want to make it easy on your customer so that they can pay the bill, right? It's a two-way street. Who knew that this would be so interesting? Number 6, fairness. Fairness around customer classes. That's a pretty subjective one, right? Number 7, I love number 7. Avoid undue discrimination. This is a classic bond right. So basically, we're going to be discriminating. Just don't do it too much. So, but this is an important thing. Implicit in this territory of rate design, you are dividing a fixed pie, right? So like I've said several times, somebody pays more, somebody pays less. So there's a lot of social policy that comes into play. And I mentioned that to the council last night. You know, at a certain point, it's up to them to make the policy decision. And really, it usually boils down to who is going to get discriminated against and how much. Absent growth. For many years in America, sloppy rate making was disguised by growth in sales. You know, people were using more energy, people were building subdivisions, people were having more babies. There was just always growth on the system that allowed sloppy rate making because you were making more money than you knew what to do with. And now that's all changed. Conservation, there's not as many people. Housing is more efficient housing stock. People are conserving resources. And all of that is meaning that you sell less. And then number 8, be economically efficient. Discourage the wasteful use of resources and offer the optimal services. So that just puts kind of constraint on giving too much stuff. Like I've had cases where they have like 24 rate classes for residential customers. Like that's violating that principle, and I try to tell them that. It gets too confusing for the consumer, and it's cumbersome to administer, and oftentimes there's really not a good reason for it. So back to passing around the mic. It's one of our favorites. See, if you're on the website, you're fair game. So, why regulate utilities? Why regulate the price they can charge? Now, I've got the 2 factors up here, but let's just talk about in common language, why?
Because the utility is a monopoly, and it could get out of control.
Exactly. You are a monopoly provider. And so that gives you a lot of rights, but it puts onus on you to behave in a certain way. And it also invites regulation. Because as a monopoly, you could charge whatever you wanted, absent regulatory oversight. Now, a lot of people argue that public utilities, because they're owned by voters, don't need as much regulation. And in fact, they're exempt from a lot of the regulation that for-profit utilities have. So who wants to take a stab at the second bullet? affected with the public interest? Who's going to be brave?
Well, as a public power, since our customers essentially own us, they are affected, and they have a voice, and it's here with the trustees. And so if they feel like their rates are too high, they essentially own us, so they can have a say in the decisions.
Implicit in what you're saying is you're not saying what you're building this answer around. It's right in the center of it. What is it about public utility services? Like, for example, if I decide I don't like the rates you're paying, yes, I can go to the council, but can I just change my provider?
No.
Can I just stop using energy?
No.
Right?
Right.
There's no substitute.
Right.
I mean, now I could put solar panels on my roof or something, but really, in the past, electricity was a novelty. Way back when, it was a novelty. It burned down houses. It, created smoky. It was a novelty. People burned gas to get light. But now, it is a necessity. And most recently, in the past 10 years, we realize that it's a public safety issue. That when there is a brownout or a blackout, there can be rioting, there can be looting. It's not a convenience. It's a public safety necessity. So the industry has shifted. So even though utilities have always been what is considered affected with the public interest, it's even become more so for electric, but water and wastewater as well, right? I mean, short of putting in outhouses again, which I know there's this tiny house thing, and we've got all these composting toilets and all this other stuff going on. When you're talking about a territory with a lot of people, a monopoly is the best choice, and there are not many substitutions. In electricity, few if any. In water, wastewater, fresh drinking water, safe drinking water. All these things matter because there's very few substitutes. So affected with the public interest is a concept that was from like the 1700s, long before electricity, but it applies today. And it basically means something that's so vital to the public interest that it must be regulated. So here's one of my favorite slides next to the picture of Lauren. I love that little zap guy. I think I'm an industrial engineer. Safety is one of my things. I think this is one of the most effective visual signs. Like if you see this sign and still get in trouble, So here's some language around what a natural monopoly is. And the first bullet, high fixed, low variable costs, especially in the old days, building a power plant, putting in distribution infrastructure, putting in piping, putting in pumps, putting in treatment facilities. All this cost a lot of money. And so you're much better off having one large monopoly doing it than every little Tom, Dick, and Harry building their own facility. And it happened early on where you would have all these little, competing, mini monopolies, but they always consolidated over time. It's a local enterprise. The further you go out of your footprint, the more expensive it gets, right? And then in electricity's case, supply must instantaneously serve demand, which I don't see, there's too many switches. Usually I flick on and off the lights because the system is balancing in response to my behavior. You can't really store electricity. You can convert it into something else that you use later, but you cannot store electricity. Supply has to instantaneously serve demand. And that just blows my mind that it all works. Every day of my life, I'm like, wow, I can't believe the lights are on. And in Orlando, often they're not. And then the little footnote at the bottom talks about how, especially for the electric industry, we've been having disruptive technology, which is really low, short lead time, cheap, relatively speaking, easy to construct, which is kind of, a game changer. And it's creating real issues for traditional utilities that they have to deal with policy and rate decisions. And this class comes pretty much down to this slide. And this study that we're conducting comes down to this slide. You're a monopoly. As a monopoly, you are allowed to recover your cost to serve plus a reasonable return. Period. End of story. So that's why we do a cost of service study. Literally. So who here knew that before today? Lauren.
I've already been through this.
Right. But in the box on the right, the box on the right, I have the quote from the Supreme Court case of the dissenting judge. So this principle of cost to serve plus a reasonable return is in part based on a Supreme Court case of the Federal Power Commission versus Hope Natural Gas. And the dissenting judge basically said, well, what is reasonable? Like, how do you know what is reasonable? So he didn't agree with this at all. And he's got a point. But you gotta put a mark in the sand and go from there. And so reasonable is left up to your city council often, or your utility trustee. This is basically what a cost of service is for any utility. It's a sorting. It's sorting into buckets. You start, and why are we even going through this exercise to sort into ever smaller buckets? What is the ultimate goal? Who wants to take a stab?
I'll come back. There's more than one answer.
Fair and transparent rates.
Fair and transparent rates. Right. As you sort into ever smaller buckets, the bucket should be close to the end user. So you sort by function first. Then you sort by, is it fixed or is it variable? Then you sort by, how does this customer use this resource? And you're really trying to line up the cost to serve that particular customer and then set a rate that is consistent with that cost. That's a big picture goal. And you can get sucked into the wormhole of data, and you can get sucked down the wormhole of financial data and numbers. And when I get to a certain point in a rate case, and there's too many numbers in my head, I just have to step back and say, what am I trying to do here? What is this cost? What service is it providing? And who should pay for it? And a lot of times, that simplifies everything. It's like, oh, yeah, that class of customer doesn't really use that part of our system. Maybe they shouldn't pay for it. But maybe everybody should pay for it. Maybe it's a social good, right? Certain costs benefit everyone on the system, whether they're directly using them or not. So the first step is setting the revenue requirement. Who here would like to take a stab at a simple explanation of what a revenue requirement is? John.
It's what you need to keep the system up and running.
Basically, right. It's simple. It's your budget. You can think of it as your budget. What does it cost me to provide the services I'm providing? And we've broken it down into some of the major categories. But really, the first step of the study is how much money do I need? How much money do I need? Because I'm going to have to design rates that collect that money, right? The second step is really the cost of service study. So once you have the bucket of money you need to collect, then you sort it. And you sort it first by function. So in electricity, it's production, transmission, distribution, customer service. In water, wastewater, collection, treatment, supply, transmission, distribution. And then there's usually a customer component. And customer components can be handled differently. Some utilities include metering and billing and any kind of those activities in customer service. Some people think metering is more of a distribution level service. There's no right or wrong answer as long as you have a reason and you're consistent in how you administer your choice. And then fixed versus variable. Why would it matter if it's a fixed cost versus a variable cost? Does everybody understand the difference between a fixed and variable cost? A fixed cost does not change with the level of activity on your system. So based on that, especially for electricity, are you guys primarily fixed cost entities or variable cost entities? What would Lauren say?
Both.
Well, because you purchase your power from GRDA. That's your biggest expense. But based on those contracts, if people don't use a lot of power, you still pay a big chunk of money, right?
Yeah, the fixed cost is very high because you're paying for all infrastructure to get here.
Say that again.
The fixed cost is very high because you're paying for all the infrastructure to get the maximum, your maximum demand here to the city, and it's the same way on the other side as well.
So essentially, it doesn't matter so much, the variable, because you're essentially largely fixed. You've put the pipe in the ground, the collection system for wastewater. Whether people flush a toilet or not, you still have to pay. If you sold bonds, you still got to make those bond payments. So the reason you want to split cost into the fixed and variable component is because you want to hopefully have enough of a fixed charge in your rate system that you're recovering your fixed cost. And you want to recover variable costs through variable charges. But often, we've been recovering a majority of our fixed costs through variable consumption-based charges. And that worked fine when there was always growth on the system. So that's one thing that's become more and more important, to increase the fixed cost component, but there's always a lot of pushback because that means every month you're going to be paying more, right? So, and that's just, it's hard to break old habits. It's hard to break old habits.
My question on that is, why is it important to have the fixed cost associated with the fixed asset? Because like you said, people give a lot of pushback when they see that fixed rate. They say, why am I paying $9 a month if I don't use any power?
And that's why this class is important, and that's why I encourage my clients, after doing a study like this and as part of a study like this, to have outreach to explain, especially with solar panels. This has become a big issue because people think, and solar salespeople tell them, oh, put a panel on your house, you're going to have no bill. But meanwhile, you've got all this infrastructure that's being paid off over time. And so it's kind of like your mortgage. If you have a 20-year mortgage and then you leave your house without selling it, the mortgage is still there, right? So that's kind of the similar thing, that infrastructure takes longer to build, and you can't just walk away from it. Like it's still there, and it's still standing ready, even if you do go solar. The system has incurred charges on your behalf. And I think this is an area where nobody can do too much to help educate the customer. So one of the little examples I use is, who here has a cell phone? Like, honestly, I used to teach these workshops, and there would still be people that didn't raise their hand. But I think everybody here, does everybody have a cell phone? What is the minimum? So who has the lowest minimum monthly charge? Does anyone pay $35 a month or less for their cell phone? I used to get people that actually raised their hand. Does anybody pay $40 or less? $50 or less? Okay, $50 a month. What is the minimum residential customer charge for electricity? $9.80. And yet you get pushback when you say we should really be charging $40 a month fixed charge for our infrastructure. But it's education, it's habit, and the way power developed in America and utilities developed in America, there is this mental block that we shouldn't have to pay more. And Jolynn has a good story about her utility. Your
Which one?
the one in Oregon. They had to.
What'd they do?
What's your customer charge in Oregon?
Oh, okay. So we have two properties, one in Arizona and one in Oregon, and we split our time between the two. And in Oregon, we purchase power from an electric cooperative. They're full requirements customer of Bonneville Power Administration, so it's all hydro. And they had a recent cost of service study, and their customer charge is between $15 and $20 a month. So it's, in my estimation, probably covering their costs. They're one of the largest cooperatives in the state of Oregon.
I thought it was 27.
It could be 27. Ask my husband, he pays the bill.
It's 27. It's 27.
And I don't have my slide to support it. But in the average cost of power, we pay about 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Now in Arizona, it's very different. We pay 12 cents average cost, and our customer charge is about $9.
And for OUC, my customer charge was $8 forever. They finally raised it to $10. But the other thing they've started to do is I have like an 11-cent power charge, and now on my bill, because Florida equals solar and OUC Orlando wants to be one of the greenest cities in America, they've started splitting out on my bill that 3.3 cents of that is energy, and the rest, 6 something, is what they're calling facilities or something like that. So what they're starting to do is tell me, you put solar panels on your roof, you're still going to owe us, 9 cents a kilowatt hour plus $10 a month. You're going to get maybe 3 cents. So it's starting to educate people about what they're paying for and why, because generally people are reasonable. They just feel it hasn't been transparent, right? They don't understand why they're having to pay what they have to pay. So that's everybody in this room's job. And then the final step is taking all those buckets and sorting down to the customer level. So again, these next slides just literally talk about what is in a revenue requirement. It's your budget. It's everything you need to include in your rates so that you're covering operating costs. Fuel, chemicals, purchased power, connection fees, public benefit funding. Do you guys have any special collections for public benefits? California is big on that. They have a lot of collections. No. And then another cross-cut at what a revenue requirement is. Capital improvements. The capital improvement infrastructure planning has to be planned for, because you set rates now, and how long are they good for? 3 to 5 years, until the council allows you to change them. It's not so. The one thing I like to say, this is an exercise in prognostication. It's like crystal ball gazing, because the weather impacts what you do. Who's moving in and out of your system, how they're using energy. All these things factor into what you're going to sell and what infrastructure you have to build. And you've got to predict that now and set rates, and then those rates are going to be in effect for at least a few years. So it's a lot of guessing. And so there's a lot of challenges in this exercise. Who here, except for Christy, I'm going to say, knows what a test year is? Has anybody encountered this concept? Like what a test year is.
Oh, me again? Oh.
Bill must know.
Bill knows. And James.
James? He's like, don't call me. made it this far. Bill, do you know what a test year is?
No, I've seen the term, I guess it's just a theoretical year of expenses and revenues balance. Theoretical year made up of revenues and expenses.
And why would we want a theoretical year?
Make sure the rate and design will work, and you'll have enough cover the cost of service.
Right. It's you can't use the budget year because that's historic. And I've just said we're predicting 3 to 5 years in the future. And so by definition, what a test year is, it's the hypothetical revenue requirement for this future-defined period that we're going to use as a basis for setting rates that probably aren't going to change for 3 to 5 years. So you're trying to get like any big expenditures on the horizon and incorporate that into a test year. And usually your test year starts using audited financials. So you take an actual, budget, audited, and then you look at it and say, well, what's going to change over the next 3 to 5 years? Is there some number in that budget that's going to go away? Usually that's not the case, but sometimes it is. But what other expenses are going to increase? And also, how is my system going to change? Am I going to need to be adding capacity for certain customers? Am I going to have a compliance issue that's going to change my cost structure? That's what a test year does. It gives you a theoretical, usually 12-month period, and on that basis, you set rates.
Basically a projected year then, so you look at history and anticipate future needs.
Yep. And as I said, it's crystal ball gazing. It's you make your best guess.
I was going to say, how do you deal with, the unexpected, like your load may be flat, like what we're seeing. We think we may have an anomaly because our usage is down slightly. So how do you adapt to that?
You have a lot of discussions, and that's when, I as the consultant can point this stuff out. But then that's one of the things we have a meeting around. What do we think's going on here? Is there better data we can look at? Is there more information? Sometimes there's not, and sometimes you just have to make your best guess, looking at, well, what if I get it wrong, right? What if we're under collecting, which you never want to be under collecting, and then, do we have other escalators, built-in escalators? Is there some way that even if we're wrong, we'll still be solvent enough to make it to the next rate case? But there are no good answers. These are the real questions. And right now, this is a dynamic time. Not only are we seeing consumption go way down, even with growth on a system. So you're having to pay costs to build out infrastructure, but you may not have the sales to pay for it. So ultimately, everybody's rates are going to have to go up unless there's some other growth that you can identify. Financing, maybe we're going to sell some bonds, and because sometimes just getting yourself a little time is a solution. But these are all really valid concerns and questions, and this is why the test year is a key part of this analysis, because this is where you start to talk about what's going to change. And then this is another way to look at a revenue requirement, that you start with your capital and operating budget. And then a term you hear, especially in IOU rate cases, but is applicable to everyone, and what we were just talking about, adjusted for known and measurable changes. And that's a kind of a legal term. So the 2 bullets. You need to know that this cost is going to be incurred. You need to be able to measure it, because these terms come from IOU rate cases, investor-owned utility rate cases, where they were just overbuilding infrastructure, or saying, well, I think I'm going to invest $10 million. Well, prove it. The regulator's more like, you need more tangible proof that you're going to be spending that money, or we're not going to let you put it in your rate base, because that's inflating rate. And then used and useful. That's another concept that you hear a lot, which means, you can't just be building stuff that's sitting idle, which IOUs did. Most of the time there's a rule or a regulation, it's because somebody was behaving badly. So you don't see this as a big issue as much in public power, public utilities, because their ratepayers and their council and they're self-regulated, won't let you just willy-nilly go build stuff that you don't need. And then this is kind of an overview of the key analysis that goes into this study. On the bottom, you see the production data. So that's pulled, Brad pulls that from your billing system. So we take usage by class, we take customer accounts, we run them through your retail rate structures. We add other revenues. You collect revenues by doing other things that aren't necessarily rate-based, and that should equal the total revenues you've collected. And we analyze several fiscal years of data to look for trends and patterns. So we're just about to complete that phase of the study. On the top, you see all the financial data that we kind of do the same exercise. We add up all your financial data, your audited statements, your budget, and we say, well, what total revenue are you collecting? And you would be surprised that those two numbers, if you haven't done a cost of service study in a long time, and if you've had change on your system, those two numbers could be way off. I once did a study for a very small public utility. It was a $2 million loss. They were running a $2 million loss on a very small budget. Luckily, they had pooled resources. So it wasn't really affecting their cash flow, but that was not sustainable. Like, they needed to adjust their rates and adjust how they were recovering, because what can happen is if you're just applying an X% increase over time for inflation to all rates, which a lot of utilities do, it's not recognizing the dynamics of each rate class. So if you have a lot of change in any of your rate classes, or how that rate class is using energy or water or wastewater, you're not collecting the revenues you thought you were collecting. And so they can get wildly off if you don't do an exercise every 3 to 5 years. And then where those two items come together, then you have to do the rate design to resolve any issues, to decide, if you're having a deficit in one customer class, how are you going to resolve that? Lots of issues. But the whole goal is that properly designed rates should generate the amount of revenue that gets you your revenue requirement. Which at the start of this class, if I had read that to you, you'd be like, well, of course, it's really simple. But hopefully now you're seeing why it gets a little complicated. And then this is another slide that just kind of communicates that it's a trade-off. You can't have it all. Absent wild growth on your system, you can't give everybody cake and ice cream and they're going to lose weight, right? You've got to understand that if somebody's going to get a lower rate, somebody's probably going to pay a higher rate. And so how do you equitably make those decisions? And then this slide just kind of talks about all the different considerations that go into this. And the term social engineering, which often refers to low income rates or special rates for like churches. You can see special rates for churches or schools or, you name it. And then other rate design that's dealing with emerging issues like conservation, which, conservation rates are inclining block rates. So the more you use, the more you pay, which is supposed to send a signal to have people use less, right? If the rate got cheaper, and there are declining block rates where the rate gets cheaper as you use more, that's, use more water, use more electricity, right? So we often have policy decisions that negatively impact your bottom line, because that's, if you have inclining block rates, in theory, you're going to sell less of your product, and that's going to impact the revenue collection. So anytime you change those kinds of rates, you almost, within a year should revisit that because they're going to work. Time of use rates, these other rates that incent a change in behavior are going to change behavior, And that's going to change your revenue. So you have to properly think about that and plan for adjusting. And then this is the same slide as the one before, but on the right you see all the things that go into rate design decisions. And some and most are political. So once you decide, I need this much money, I'm under collecting, oftentimes it's a very political discussion of how you're going to make up that extra money. Who's going to pay more? Are everybody's rates going up? Are certain people's rates going up more than others? And this is a point in a study where the cost of service can serve to send information to decision makers. Well, on a cost basis, this is really what they should be paying. This is what they are paying. Maybe working every rate class closer to cost of service. And that may mean a certain rate class gets a higher rate increase than another rate class. But being able to communicate why. So I think this is a great time to take a comfort break. Yes. So how about 10 minutes? Come back at about 12 after.
She's wondering what the hell's going on.
I wonder who controls that.
The little lady that we met over here, I believe.
So
And
she's
you know
watching it on
what?
the
And it
monitor?
wasn't, and they weren't showing you, they were showing the slides. Yeah. Oh, no. I wish I would have been smart enough to print two on page, but I wasn't. It's going to be Dana, Christine, and we're gonna flesh out fees and those things, or if we're gonna separate them. Like average it and comes out. Absolutely. And it doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter to me. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started now on what I think is the most fun, exciting part of the workshop.
Bill's smiling, he's back there. Brenda's coming in, he's smiling. The water side, most important, she said it's the most important.
Well, it certainly is the most fun,
Yeah.
kind of. So let's go to the first slide and look at the water utility services. Water is one of those things that is essential to life. And for a utility to provide clean, safe water is a public health issue serving the public interest. And there's a lot that goes into it. Someone said to me once, they said, you know, water is really no big deal. It's a bunch of ditches and it's a bunch of pumps and it's just a bunch of pipes. And I initially was offended by that, and then I thought, well, it's kind of true. But then when you look at the graphic on this slide and you look at a water treatment plant and the supply process, you see that it's far more than just pumps and ditches. And I'd like to ask one of the water gentlemen in our group today to kind of walk us through the SUA water treatment process. I think it's important to understand this as we start looking at the costs and determine rates. Sorry, Bill.
Okay, sure. We start out at Call Lake and pay the Corps of Engineers to store the water that we're going to use. Pump it 36 miles to a treatment plant, treat it, pump it and distribute it through 500 plus miles of water line, and let our customers use it. And then when they're finished with it, we recollect it through all the sewer lines to the sewer plant, treat it, and then discharge it back into Brush Creek.
Thank you. Thank you.
We monitor many parts of the system, probably not as many as we'd like to. For example, at the water treatment plant, we're taking samples and running tests on them every 2 hours. We monitor pressure, amount of storage, electronically, remotely, continuously. We check water quality by various measures in the distribution system periodically.
So there's a lot of computers and technology that go into water that the normal customer wouldn't know about.
Right, and it's a ready-to-serve system, just like the other utilities that we're talking about. Whether you're there turning the tap on or not, fresh water for drinking and bathing and watering your lawn and all the other uses, the water is ready to serve you whether you are there or not. And what it takes to get that water to you is running 24/7, 365. So on the next slide, we're going to talk just a basic overview. Instead of going over what Lisa has already shared with us, in the water and wastewater sections, we're simply going to look at the things that are specific to water and wastewater. So we're starting with water, and the picture on the right is a picture of a book that is a kind of like a Bible, if you will, about the principles of water rate making, fees, charges, methodology. Either you will read this kind of book and be really excited about it, or you'll be asleep after the first page or so. I get pretty excited. We were talking about Bombright the other day, and I was saying my Bombright book is in Arizona, and I've missed it for 3 months now, and I've got to get another copy because I always like having it as a reference, as well as this AWWA, American Water Works Association M1 Manual for Rates and Rate Setting. Now, I'd like to call your attention to the assigned costs under functional unbundling. And for the water system, we functionally unbundle. We'll talk a little more about this, but for supply and treatment, for transmission, distribution, and customer, sometimes transmission is broken out depending on if you have raw water customers, as well as the treatment if you have raw water customers that the cost wouldn't be assigned to those customers. Otherwise, then we're working with the same fixed and variable, a direct assigned customer. We allocate cost to customer class and then design rates. So it's the same story as Lisa provided the overview. So we'll start with revenue requirements and things that are specific, same general and administrative expenses, but the second bullet, the expenses that are required to operate and maintain the water system for O&M, specific to water, and we'll look at some of those specifics on the next slide. But also, I think it's important to point out the last bullet, where other applicable general and administrative cost allocations. So for each of the utilities, there's costs that are allocated based on a variety of things to everyone. And is there anyone, probably Christy would know, the areas of costs that are allocated to each of the utilities? I'll start. Administrative costs can be allocated to each of the utilities based on a predetermined or approved allocator. So aside from administrative costs,
We have general overhead across the city that includes accounting, city manager's office, legal, HR, and something IT.
Oh, okay.
That's allocated to the SUA. And then within the SUA, we have some overhead that includes those administrative costs, as well as things like bank charges. Our fleet maintenance department is allocated out.
Thank you.
Our utility and billing services.
Right. And those allocations are made to water, wastewater, and electric based on different percentages and solid waste. And solid waste. But on the next slide, we'll look at revenue requirements, O&M expenses that are specific to water. So we've got water mains, the transmission and distribution, the maintenance and repair of those mains, chemicals, for instance. Now, I was looking at the budget yesterday, and for the water treatment plant, what percentage of O&M would you guess would be chemicals? Would it be 10% of the total cost of the water treatment plant? Would it be 30, 50%?
I don't know the percent, but it's 450,000
$450,000
annual for chemicals.
$450,000 a year for chemicals to treat the water. Oh, how do you know that? Yes, it is. You're correct, because I added it up and double-checked, and it's between 30 and 40%. That's a lot of money, but it's also very important and unique to water, the chemicals that are used. So hydrant and valve maintenance for waters, the cost of utilities, which would be electricity. Do you have a number on electricity from the budget?
No, ma'am, we have a very generous electric utility.
Pardon me? It's free, yes, I understand that.
Yeah, we're not billed for electric.
Not billed for electric.
From Stillwater Electric Utility. You have other utilities, we have some of our more rural facilities have central electric, and we pay an electric bill there. We have, gas service to some locations, including the wastewater plant. They use a lot of gas.
Yes, and for the water, the electric from the other rural electrics are around $250,000 to $300,000, aside from what you're getting from what the SUA is providing. The water treatment plant is very chemical and utility intensive in terms of cost. Those are the things that you don't think about when you take a drink of fresh cold water out of the tap. Booster station, pumps, maintenance, a lot of money, a lot of moving parts there, and absolutely critical. As well as storage tank maintenance, painting the storage tanks, maintaining them, and the water treatment. Now, the last thing I'm going to address here is water supply, purchased water supply. And you all have water rights, as I understand it, from the Caw Reservoir that are used, but other ways of purchasing water include in different states, for instance, water credits. You can buy water credits that allow you a certain acre feet of water. Groundwater is another way. In some states, municipals purchase water from regional water authorities, and that's their only source of water. So there's a variety of ways to purchase your water supply. Yes?
Just a question that maybe answering will help me understand, but maybe people that might be watching. Even though water isn't paying for the electricity, it still costs money. How does that factor into the rate discussion?
It's my understanding that it's a social cost. It's a cost that is included. It's a. Yeah. Yes.
Well,
So all municipal buildings do not pay for the electricity. We supply that for them, but it's included in the rates as well, and we consider it losses.
Okay.
Much like a street light, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the cost is socialized across to everyone, and it's paid as part of the rate base. Yeah. So for water, when we look at cost of service, as we look at water demand projections, we look at historical trends in customer bases, historical uses. We look at anything that may have happened in the historic data that would have either skewed it or changes. We look for significant variances. And then as Lisa talked about earlier, we adjust for known and measurable changes over the planning horizon. And some of those can be customer growth and trends. It can be adding facilities. It can be annexations. If a municipal is annexing a rural area into their service territory, that would be a known and measurable change. Weather, which could either be a drought or having looked at the 200-year event that you all experienced a few months ago. It could be contractual term changes, or it could be it could be a whole lot of things. But those are the discussions that we have specific to the water, wastewater, and electric utilities as we're looking at forecasting in the future. So next we look at assigning costs. What is fair? And this is when we look at the cost based on the function, the supply, treatment, transmission, distribution, and customers, the fixed and variable costs through classification, and then a number of ways to allocate the costs specific to customer classes, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple slides. So the next slide shows us how we functionally unbundle. And again, just to note, I think is important that overhead and the shared costs are allocated to each of the functional areas. This is where we take the budget and we start putting costs into buckets. Are the costs associated in supporting supply and treatment? Are they transmission and distribution, or only transmission, not distribution costs, and then also customer? And again, I know we're repeating some of this, but it's because of the level of importance in what we're doing for the study. And that is that the goal of assigning costs is so that the activity correlates the rates to the cost of service. What is the function, and how does that get included in the cost of service? Again, the accepted methodologies for each of the utilities is a bit different, but overall pretty similar. And with water, it's that AWWA M1 manual. So then we go to classifying costs, and we're looking at fixed and variables. Lisa touched on some of this, but I would say specific to the water utility, under billing, meter, and customer costs is the minimum charges and water allowances. Now, for some utilities, your first certain amount, 2,000 gallons, say, of water is included in your minimum charge. That is not the case here in Stillwater, but in some municipals, it is included in the rate as a fixed component. Now, the commodity costs, the variable costs, are those that vary with the volumes that are either produced or delivered. And also included in those variable costs are the chemicals, the electricity, purchased water, and other costs that are variable O&M costs. So at that point, our buckets are getting smaller and smaller. We start with the big budget of the revenue requirement. We functionally unbundle to the next size bucket. We classify under fixed and variable. And at that point, then we allocate to customer classes. You can see that under supply and treatment, there would also be transmission, distribution, and customer. So the graphic could get larger, but the bottom line is that the costs are then allocated out to customer classes. Now, the next slide talks about cost allocation methods for water. which are specific, of course. And for those of you that love math as much as I do, you'll kind of like this slide. For those of you that don't, you probably have crossed eyes already, and that's okay. Because right. So the AWWA manual has two different methods that it recommends for allocating costs. One is a commodity demand allocation, and the other is called a base extra capacity method. And both of these methods of allocation recognize two important factors. One is that the allocations are based on the total volume used, and two, on the peak demand requirements of use on the system. So generally, and I would say generally almost all the time, we use the base extra capacity method, and the reason for that is that it drills down specifically looking by customer class, not just at average usage, but at peak. It develops peaking factors, which we apply then to test year daily averages for a maximum day usage. So this is the way that we allocate. So if your eyes are crossed, we'll just go to the next slide and leave that math to those of us who love numbers. So we've established the revenue requirement, assigned the cost, taken our costs down into buckets, specifically down to customer costs, and now it's time to design rates. And designing rates is about what makes sense. There is not a right or a wrong answer when it comes to designing rates. It's the opportunity to meet the needs of the municipal utility and its customers. It's important, of course, the goals are to recover our revenue requirement and to provide revenue stability for the utility. So this is another fun slide, colors and numbers, but these are traditional water rate structures. And for the base charge, utilities sometimes can have a flat base charge, or it can have a base charge based on the meter size. And why would you think that the base cost might be based on a meter charge? Because it's a little more complicated, a little more difficult to explain to your customers, so why would you do it? John, do you want to answer? You got the mic.
I will defer that question to someone else, but I have another one about electricity before we're done.
Oh, we'll get to electricity. Yes, water, gentlemen?
A larger meter in general requires larger infrastructure to serve it and the capacity that it is capable of using, whether it uses it or not.
Excellent, right. So the flows through the larger meters, there's more flow through them, which makes sense then that the fixed costs would be higher. And AWWA has meter equivalent. They have charges. There's a lot of support for the charges and the differentiation between the meter size charges. So then for the volumetric and consumption rates, there's a number of ways to develop and design rates. So there could be a flat rate. It could just be a certain flat rate per 1,000 gallons for water. Some utilities do that. Others use block rates. And any idea or thoughts on why a utility might implement or have block rates, whether it's an inclining block or a declining? Inclining means the charges get higher as the blocks get higher, the usage is higher. So why might they use a block rate for water?
I would assume it would tend to have people conserve water, save, would be a climbing block purpose.
Right.
It would also charge those heavier users, which might be able to afford it, let them pick up some of the tab.
Absolutely. Now, if you look at the first tier under residential volume charge, 0 to 6,000 gallons, does that mean anything to anybody? Why might that tier be 0 to 6,000?
Because a lot of people probably don't use more than that in your residential.
Right.
Or like me, I try to stay under that first.
Right, right. So it meets two goals. It can help because it's a lower block. It's for non-discretionary use. It's the average for someone bathing, for a family bathing and not necessarily watering their acre. So, and it's the same for the commercial, where you can see that the volume tier starts at a higher from 0 to 40,000. Go ahead.
I have a story, a real story from the utility that I worked for that I'm not going to call out again. They were told by their regulators, the city council, to implement conservation rates. And my boss was the head of the underground utilities. And he believed that that was counterproductive, since we make money by selling more water, right? So he did implement conservation rate, and this just shows you how rate design can accomplish different goals. So this is in Florida. The first tier was 0 to 12,000. So he complied. We did have inclining block rates, but by the way the tiers were set, it didn't really impact hardly anybody.
It wasn't effective, right. Great story, and understandable from a revenue standpoint and a usage standpoint. Is there anything else? Any questions that anyone has on this slide? Lisa, is there anything you'd like to add on the slide?
No, my big point is, the tiers matter.
They do matter.
And I was actually impressed that you knew why he set the, well done.
Yep. So on the next slide, just a brief overview on riders and surcharges. Now, riders and surcharges are fees that are charged in addition to the base rate charges, and they use a variety of structures. The goal of riders and surcharges is to recover dollar for dollar, which means it's a pass-through. It's an amount of money that's being collected for revenue to meet a certain goal, or dollars that are estimated to be incurred. And for water, we've seen a variety of riders and surcharges, including aging infrastructure, like a debt service surcharge, where they take the debt service payments, they separate that out from the rate base. Environmental compliance, which is really an important part of water as well as wastewater, based on what Bill said, and that's just the tip of the iceberg for what the environmental compliance costs are to the utility. You can include them in the rate base, you can separate them out as a rider or surcharge. In areas where there's drought, there can be drought surcharges that have been developed. In Arizona, they generally have a surcharge for future water supply, and it's for the credits that they're going to have to buy in the future to procure or have water supply at all. Those are considered the riders there. Then rate stabilization. Now, I just want one guess, then we're off to wastewater. What is an elevation surcharge for water? You ever heard of that, Bill?
I've never heard of it, but I assume it would be for customers at higher elevation because it requires more pumping.
Absolutely. I just think that's the coolest one.
Well, and actually, like Roseville, California, they have to reduce the pressure because the water is coming down the mountain. So their water system has a problem that very few that I know of have, where if they don't reduce the pressure, like the water would destroy things coming out of the pipe.
So this was the last slide on water. We're going to quickly go through wastewater because, as you can see, I'm talking for too long, and I think it's important we get to electricity. But this is a schematic of the wastewater treatment process where there is a collection system. Go ahead. Bill, you're on. Or, there you go. There you go. Can you walk us through just briefly the SUA wastewater treatment process?
Sure. So our collection system delivers the wastewater down to the treatment plant via a system of small pipes and larger pipes that generally follow the creek and flows into the primary pump station there, the wastewater treatment plant. From there, it gets pumped up to a series of basins that start to separate out solids from wastewater, digest it, and separate the solids again until eventually you have the water to everything. It takes a lot of electricity to move arms, it takes a lot of electricity to blow air, it takes a lot of electricity to pump sludge around, and eventually it's discharged. I guess there's a little chemical treatment, and then they discharge it out to Brush Creek, back to the Cimarron, the Arkansas, Winsbury.
Now, do you send your solids out for any agricultural purposes, or is it all sent out?
We land apply our biosolids.
Okay.
And it is a Class B, and it's their own.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. So you see, you don't just flush the toilet and it all goes away. It takes a lot of process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the next slide, the thing I see that's most unique is under the functional unbundling again, where treatment and pumping, collection and customer are the unbundling, the functional unbundling that we do for wastewater. And then again, the same fixed and variable and allocate to customer classes. So the revenue requirement, again, what is needed to operate and maintain the wastewater treatment plant and system. The next slide talks about O&M expenses that are specific, and these are just a few examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but the collection system, the maintenance, operations expense, cost of utilities, as you indicated, it takes a lot of electricity. Again, treatment plant equipment, which again is going 24/7, 365. There's a lot of moving parts. Oftentimes there's equipment rental that's used as part of the wastewater treatment and operation. And as you can expect, chemicals. Lots of chemicals. So next we're going to assign costs, and we're asking again, what is fair? And there are some things on this slide that are unique to wastewater. When we unbundle costs based on the function, we look at collection and then we look at treatment. Now, treatment generally, we look at volume of the treatment to unbundle it and assign it the function. But with wastewater, depending on the study that we're doing, we also can break out the BOD, or biochemical oxygen demand, and TSS for total suspended solids. Those are complex terms, but they're also important terms, not for you to understand specifically what they are, but to just know that for users that discharge waste with perhaps chemicals, industrial customers, that discharge a higher level of chemicals, there are additional costs to the system to break those down. And oftentimes in our studies, we present a rate, or we develop a rate or a surcharge associated with the BOD and TSS charges. Then, of course, we classify based on the nature and allocate to customer classes based on volumes, but also based on strength of discharge if we have high discharge customers in the municipal utility that we're looking at or working with. So again, we functionally unbundle overhead costs with the same goal of rates correlating to the cost of service. Then we look at, again, fixed and variable costs. But for wastewater, what's unique is that under treatment, we look at volume, BOD, and TSS being that high-strength amount of discharge. Otherwise, fixed and variable costs, this is the whole picture from fixed and variable down to our customer classes and the allocations for the customer classes. And again, now we're back to rate design. What makes sense as far as rate design goes? For wastewater, rate structures can be flat. They can be based on connection sizes. Now, that's a water meter connection or connection size. It's not necessarily, people want to think that wastewater is metered. But wastewater isn't metered. You have one wastewater? Tell us about it.
Yeah, we have one customer where their wastewater is metered, and that's the county fair.
The county fairgrounds. And why would they have a metered wastewater connection?
Because a significant amount of their usage is going to go to washdown and non-waste. So a water meter isn't necessarily a good measure, and our normal winter averaging method is not a good application.
Excellent. So that's a great example by the SUA of understanding its customers and making sure that the needs, one of the customer are being met, but also the SUA is being met because you have that meter data and information. So on the just the volumetric charges, you brought up being based on winter average. Wastewater charges, volumetric, are often based on a winter average, which can be 3 to 4 months. That can be different for different customer classes. It can be a...
Why do we use a winter average?
Why do we use a winter average? Anyone have an idea? Why in water would we use a winter average?
We use the winter average because people water in the summer, and that water is not wastewater that we treat.
It is. That's exactly right. Excellent. You get an A+ for the day. Right. And it's non-discretionary water use, right? It's in the winter, we aren't using water to water the lawn and to do extra things. We're using it to bathe, the necessities that we have for life. And not all utilities, some utilities do 100% of water. Some of them do a winter average for residential customers, and all other wastewater customers, it's 100% of water or any percentage that's determined. Last slide, surcharges, aging infrastructure, again, environmental compliance, and the BOD and TSS can be rates, riders, or surcharges. Wow.
We're almost there. We're almost there. Hang in there. But you've seen it's all the same. So these slides will go faster because we're just going to talk about what's different. Again, the whole concept is any service you provide, you need to account for the cost of that and make sure you're capturing it in your rates. So these are the main services that an electric utility provides. They may generate power, they may buy power supply, then they have wires infrastructure to deliver that power, and then they provide customer care. Again, you're going to set your revenue requirement, and then you're going to sort it into 4 main buckets: production, generation, transmission, which transmission isn't determined by the size of the wire. A lot of people think transmission are the big power lines and distribution are little lines. But that's not technically true. So Lauren, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you know the difference between transmission and distribution? And this is tricky.
Voltage?
No.
No.
Not many people know this. So I'm putting Lauren on the spot, but like honestly, geeks like me know this, and some federal regulatory people know this.
Educate me.
Wholesale versus retail. Doesn't that blow your mind? Wholesale transactions are considered transmission because the federal government regulates that.
But in our case, we have transmission and it's still retail.
If it's retail, it's not federally regulated. So technically, it's not. Transmission is defined as wholesale for resale. And it's to show who has jurisdiction, essentially. It's very obscure. It's very obscure. It's in like the Federal Power Act.
Interesting.
So it's not the size of the wire, it's the nature of the transaction. And then, as I talked about earlier, there's a lot of forecasting and prognostication because you're setting rates now based on future conditions that you won't know are going to materialize. So for those reasons, you try to do a lot of studies to analyze what's happened on my system, what's going to happen on my system, and looking at discrete customer classes because customers can behave very differently depending on socioeconomic factors, what type of industry, like if you have a couple large industrial customers, understanding their industry, what's happening to them, like are they going to be out of business in a few years or are they going to be growing? Especially if they're a significant portion of your revenue. And then the final thing, load management, demand side management. Houses are more efficient. Appliances are more efficient. People are being more aware of how they're using power and managing their power. And all these things are great for the globe and the world, but not necessarily for sales. So again, we go through these steps. We unbundle, we classify, and we allocate. And for electricity, these are the types of factors for splitting load or costs between customer classes. You can look at demand, which is, I like Jolene's explanation of demand versus energy. Your Nordstrom's example. The lights in the air conditioner?
Oh, peak? Yeah. Oh, boy. Yeah, so this company that I buy power for, and they're a national retail clothing store. They're Nordstrom, who you may or may not be familiar with. If you're a man who's married, you hope your wife is not familiar with them. And if you're a woman, you hope your husband is okay with you shopping there. But in terms of their energy use, one of the things that we have to carefully look at, that they look at, is in the morning, when people come, if the store opens, say, at 9, and at 8:45, they come in and turn on all the lights, all the elevators, all the escalators, the air conditioner, everything at once, their demand is spiked. And depending on where they are in the United States, that one peak that happens in a 12-month period can ratchet them or take them up into a higher demand charge. So that's kind of an understanding of demand. It's when all your usage happens, it's measured in 15-minute increments. So the highest usage in 15 minutes, so within 15 minutes, whether it's a janitor, whether it's a system, turns everything on, their electric bills can increase by 25 to 50% over a 12-month period for the next 12 months.
So that's the best explanation for non-technical people of the difference between demand and energy. Energy is how much, how many kilowatt hours you use. Demand is turn on everything on the system, full blast, all at once, and that how much power could you possibly use? That's your peak, and that's demand. So I don't know if that helps, but I like to think of it that way. This next slide talks a little bit about splitting into the 4 categories. And again, overhead G&A gets allocated into each of those functional bundles. We then classify by fixed and variable. And then finally, we allocate to customer classes. So we talked about demand versus energy. So you can look at peaking in many different ways. And there is no right or wrong way to allocate based on demand. It depends on your system. It depends on policy goals. And there's different answers even in sub-customer classes. So a lot of large rate cases focus a lot on these different allocation methods. And with peaking, you can allocate on one coincident peak, which is when the whole system peaks. So on this little slide, we can see that this system peaks in September. So you look at the 12 months, we've got 3 customer classes on this graph, and you can see that the annual CP occurs in September. So if we were allocating on one CP, we would take the bucket of costs, and each customer class in September, that would be the proportion that they get, based on what their peak was that one point in time, that 1 month. We could also say we're going to allocate costs on non-coincident peak, which means over the course of the year, when did that customer class peak? And as you can see from this graph, Class B peaked in April, Class C peaked in November, and Class A peaked in September. We would add those amounts together, and then we would ratio cost based on each class's allocation during that month. And you could do it a 12 CP. 12 CP would be every class every month. That's the ratio. You could do seasonal. That would be a 2 CP. You could peak the summer month, winter month. So there's no end of ways to slice and dice this. There are no right or wrong answers, but the outcomes financially are very different based on what you pick as an allocator. And so in big rate cases, there's a lot of fighting over what those numbers should be because your rates change based on that. So again, this should be very familiar by now, the 3 steps. And then traditional rate structures. We have a flat rate, we have a 2-part rate, you can have a 3-part rate, and then inclining or declining blocks or seasonal rates. And with that, well, riders and surcharges, we've talked about those. And we're only 35 seconds over. But we will stay and answer any questions. And thank you all for participating. Any questions or comments? Oh, you had a question about electric.
Yeah. Don't know that.
You do now.
Yeah.
Going back to what I was asking earlier, is it just a philosophical thing as to where those electric charges show up in the rate structure? For, like water is getting it for free, in quotes, does electric's rates cover that free, or does water's rates cover that free? Is that just a philosophical decision, or is there some rhyme or reason behind it?
I would say that's built into the rate structure of the utility that's paying the cost associated with that, so it would be built into the electric.
That was going to be my guess. But the water, wastewater provider utilities support that.
Do utilities in general make that decision as a, well, we're just going to do it this way? Or is there some reason you might want to make it a certain way?
It depends on your, especially in public power. If we were talking an IOU, like an investor-owned utility, their state regulatory agency would decide that. Like they can present their option, but ultimately the regulator would make a decision because obviously it affects different ratepayers. For public power, you're self-regulated. So it really is up to your trustees if they wanted to change that. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. So Gainesville, for example, I just did their rate study. They recover those costs from each utility. So there's all these transfers that happen so that the electric utility is paying the gas utility for gas, and the gas utility is paying the electric utility for electric, and water and wastewater are the same. So, and it's pretty complicated, but that's just the way they've done it.
I'm thinking, I've seen in some communities, I think like Palmer City, the electric utility sends them a bill to the city government. General fund pays the bill just like they're paying electric.
And
Anybody.
There could be a municipal rate class. So you're charged, but you're charged at a different rate than any other customer class.
I would like to just make one comment about that, is that in some cities that are municipal utilities that I've done cost of service for, they didn't have any idea. There wasn't a bill going out, and nobody was keeping track whether the municipal accounts were metered or not. So until they had a cost of service done, they had no idea what the amount of those free utility services were that might have been paid, and yet there's still costs that are socialized, that are spread across everyone in terms of rate, even if whether it's specific to each utility, those costs still are included. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just seems to me that specific one in terms of water rates and electric rates has an impact on the customers themselves. As everybody, if we're providing utilities for city facilities, we're providing streetlights, et cetera, that's kind of spread out maybe amongst everybody, whereas this one seems very specific to water and sewer rates versus electric rates on its impact to customers. Say I get my water from a well, well, I'm paying extra electric for water's use of that. And it probably wouldn't affect very many people, but it seems like that's one where it's very specific to that utility. Is that right?
I would say yes, you're right on track. But then we would want to evaluate the cost benefit of starting to track and bill all of those city meters, and how much is that going to cost, and then what's the benefit.
Isn't that already tracked in the city file? Oh, yeah, it's already tracked. Hasn't been analyzed yet in terms of the cost of service, but it will.
No, you don't have a specific address, and we don't necessarily know. I mean, we know it's a city meter, but we may not know, well, that should get allocated to electric. We don't do any interdepartmental billing. We track everything as a whole, so that we know all city facilities use this much water, electric, wastewater.
And sometimes those costs are seen as public good. I mean, that's part of the socializing of the cost, is that it's for the public good. It's like the fire department, being a public service, a variety of others, and that's how it's seen in some municipalities.
Well, like the library, if you think our customers go use the library, so they don't pay for that electric and water
you know, you're really validating, this conversation is validating the fact that there is no right, there is no wrong. There are political and social economic decisions that are made by each community that are right, or some people could argue not right, specific to that community. But at the end of the day, we are a community. And no matter how those costs are incorporated into the rates, there will be an impact somewhere. It's the old competing objective.
Well, this is an area where technology is changing things too. Like, because in the past, metering was an issue. Like, you couldn't meter, you know, lights easily. Like, there were a lot of, especially in the electric, that because metering would have been prohibitive, it was unmetered usage. Well, now with technology and smart meters, you can meter almost anything. So then the question is, well, is it time to revisit some of the ways we've been doing stuff based on better data? Like demand charges for residential customers, you know? So there's a lot of change, and some of it's technology driven. But again, there's no right or wrong answer. You have to make this decision with your trustees, and also just make sure you're not discriminating in some way. Like if one, you know, if the library's the only one paying the bill, you know, like then that begs the question why. Well, thank you, everybody. You've been very patient. We appreciate your participation. And if you have any questions, I think the email address or phone number is on the back. Feel free to reach out. And I'm sure we'll be talking to most of you over the next couple months.